all the way back to America. Now, the difference between the Native Americans who traveled again over the Bering Strait all the way down here and the Puritans who came across the Atlantic, another difference is the reason why they traveled, right? The Puritans, we just discussed, traveled because of religious reasons, all right? The Indians traveled probably more because they were following food or they were just wanting more land. Now that becomes a big difference, right? As you found out, the Native Americans had a religion, right? They had a concept of what they thought were gods or spirits, but it wasn't the reason why they moved or they traveled. However, for the Puritans, it was that reason, which is why we have the Constitution that we do, which is the separation of church and state, right? Our president has nothing to do with our churches for that reason, because a major idea in our founding by the Puritans, remember these guys, is they wanted a separation between church and state. They didn't want the head of the government to also be head of the church. Okay, so now let's talk about our third group. All right, our third group did not come into this section, right? The Puritan area where we have Boston and New York and all of that. We're talking about the pioneers. So we're talking about these people who lived in log cabins and had covered wagons, and they came to the more open and wild areas of the U.S. of the time. So we would have to go further west from this area of the Puritans here and get into where we talk about Lewis and Clark, where we start out here in the western parts of Virginia, all right, moving on into Kentucky. Now, here's the reason why the people who went into these areas were pioneers, and it has to do with this area right here. See this? The part in green, it's called the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's part of a bigger mountain chain that you see here, highlighted in green, called the Appalachian Mountains. Why am I talking about mountains? Because mountains are natural barriers. All right, it's more difficult to cross a mountain than it is to cross a level plain. So in this area, they had no problems settling here along the coast, but to go further meant to go past these mountains, which was a harder thing to do. So it was the pioneers who went past the Appalachian Mountains. Again, these guys, right? They look more rough and rugged because they had to be, right? So why did they travel, right? We've already talked about Native Americans probably traveled for food, for land and space. The Puritans traveled for religious freedom and so they could get away from a king that they did not like, right? Why did the pioneers come across the mountains? Did they come for religious freedom? No, they didn't. By and large, they came because of the prospect of space and land and something they could own and be in charge of. They were fiercely independent. All right, so here I ask you, are the pioneers in their reason for travel, are they more like the Native Americans or are they more like the Puritans up here? They're more like the Native Americans, right? Remember, Puritan movement was primarily driven by religious understanding. Native Americans driven by food, land, space, territory, which is very much like the pioneers, which also caused them to clash, right? Think about some of the pieces that we've read. We have Andrew Jackson's speech, which took Indians that were all in all of this area, remember from Louisiana way down here, hello hometown, right? All the way up to Kentucky, way up here, all this area, all these Indians in this area, where did we move them to? According to Andrew Jackson's speech, which, by the way, is a primary source because he's the one who said it. He's not talking about the past. He's talking about his day. We moved them through the Trail of Tears, which is what it was called, to Oklahoma, Indian Territory. All right, and that's where a large section of Indian reservations exist today in Oklahoma because of what Andrew Jackson did, moving all of these Indians who were in this area over to Oklahoma. Now that begs the question, why did he move? Why did we move them here? Well, we moved them here not for the Puritans up here. Remember, they're all happy. They've made cities now, right? That's where we have New York and Boston and all of that. But no. We moved the Indians for the pioneers. Remember, the group that went across the Appalachian Mountains into Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, Illinois, Arkansas, right? We wanted to control, by the way, we wanted to control the Mississippi. And we wanted to control all this land on the eastern side of it. But remember, from the novel you're reading, Undaunted Courage, Thomas Jefferson was concerned with more than just the eastern side of the Mississippi. He wanted to know what was out here, which is a good time for you to look. Lewis and Clark, which again is a primary source, traveled up through Missouri, Iowa, South Dakota, right? All the way up here into the Bitterroot Range. That's actually one of the chapters, right? They crossed this area. They crossed the Rocky Mountains. You can see it outlined here in green, right? And they went up here to Oregon and the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, not the Chesapeake Bay, but into the bays here along the Pacific. Okay? So that covers our three groups. Now, what we will be doing, that being said, is we'll be taking these three, the American pioneers, the Native Americans, and the Puritans, and you will be discussing how they're alike and how they're different. But you'll use the pieces that we've read to back up what you're saying.